So hello and welcome to Horse Race Politics. I'm Dr. Matthew Wall. I'm an Associate Professor of Politics at Swansea University, and I'm joined by my colleagues.
Hi, my name's Dr. Elena Kilby, and I'm a lecturer in journalism in the Department of Media and Communication at Swansea.
I'm Dr. Richard Thomas. I'm a senior lecturer in journalism, also in the same department, Swansea University's Department of Media and Communications.
So we're all academics specialised in the study of campaigns and political communication.
And we've created this podcast to share our analysis of the 2020 US presidential election campaign in real time as it unfolds, using information from political gambling markets to keep score.
So the podcast will drop every Friday running into the vote, and it'll bring you up to speed with the start of the race, and it'll help you to filter out the noise of the campaign, and it'll focus on the stories, the trends, and the big moments that really matter.
So this week we focus mainly on Tuesday's explosive first presidential debate, which was watched by over 73 million Americans. But already that's starting to be old news, and we have to kick off the show, I suppose, by dealing with the breaking news just this morning that Donald Trump and his wife Melania have both tested positive for COVID-19. So this has led to an explosion of speculation about what it means for the campaign. In terms of the betting markets, their reaction has been very clear. So when we finished recording our segment on the debate, Biden was seen as 20% more likely to win than Trump. He's stretched to over 30%, but about 35% more likely in the light of this morning's revelations. So it's about 65, 35, even a bit stronger on some markets. And I don't think the markets have even fully digested this news as I'm recording. Some of the most prominent markets like Betfair have actually suspended betting because of the volume, I suppose, of activity and the fundamental uncertainty that this creates in the race. Now, I mean, looking at the reaction on social media, there's an array, as you might imagine, of narratives. I suppose, ironically, Donald Trump is finding himself accused of generating fake news by many people who are doubtful of the veracity of his claims. He is an attempt to garner sympathy or alter the narrative of the campaign. I myself am pretty skeptical of that, not because of any fundamental belief in Donald Trump's honesty, but because I see this as being, strategically very, very difficult to overcome for a couple of reasons. In the first place, as we'll discuss following the debate, Donald Trump was well behind in this campaign, and the debate hadn't turned that around really significantly at all. And so the most likely thing with Donald Trump self-isolating is a radical de-escalation of campaign activities, a sort of a freezing in and around the status quo. So we talk in the rest of the episode about how Donald Trump needs to do something to change the momentum. Well, this makes that much more difficult. Secondly, I think it freezes the campaign narrative on the topic of COVID-19. And you might remember from our first episode that Richard was talking about how COVID-19 is one of the issues that's most difficult in terms of public opinion for Donald Trump to be talking about. It's not something that he wants to be talking about. He'd rather make the conversation about something else. So for those two reasons, I agree, I suppose, with the markets that there's not really many ways that this can turn out very well for Donald Trump. Now, one counter narrative is the well-known, it's called the rally around the flag effect. And this is the idea that when there's a real national crisis, nearly no matter how unpopular a president is, that they receive a sort of at least a short-term boost in popular support. So we saw this really prominently with George W. Bush in the aftermath of the 9/11 bombings. But this is a slightly different type of crisis, I feel. It's one that the nation has been experiencing for quite a long time that has just now turned, I suppose, on the Trump family. And as such, I wonder if the type of dynamics that facilitate rally around the flag are really there in this instance. It also has to be said there's been a lot of extremely unpleasant, I think, reaction online talking about how this is some kind of karma or justice. Let's face it, wishing death on Donald Trump. And I mean, I think we talk again in the podcast about how nasty this campaign has gotten, and I suppose the bigger picture coming out of it is whether America can a country have this as its political norm, where large portions of the population are wishing the candidates dead in an election campaign. But it does bring us to that unfortunate topic of the death of a presidential candidate. And so political science researchers have been looking up their old textbooks on the US Constitution this morning, including myself. So there is a scenario where if Donald Trump unfortunately succumbs to COVID-19, the candidate selection process goes back to the Republican Party. They have a process in place by which their delegates kind of vote for another candidate. You'd have to imagine Mike Pence would be a strong favourite if that was to happen. This is complicated significantly by the fact of early voting and the fact that ballots with Donald Trump's name have already been cast. We're in kind of new territory there, but one might imagine it would be difficult to strike down a proposition that Donald Trump's votes get counted for his replacement candidate. Of course, if Donald Trump manages to win, or Joe Biden, if anyone manages to win, and they've died between their election victory and the inauguration, there's the whole mess of the electoral college system. So in America, it's not, the votes don't directly count. You vote for delegates who go on to vote for the president in the electoral college. And there's potential for huge complication and litigation in that eventuality that the delegates are unable to vote for their candidate because they've passed away. So I mean, we really are in unprecedented territory, and there are numerous trajectories, ultimately all depending on the the health of the president and how he responds to COVID-19. But for me, there are a lot more paths that are challenging and difficult for Donald Trump than there are paths that might lead you to think that he's making this up or that it's a good thing for him. To me, and to the betting markets, it's a bad thing. And as I leave you this morning, Joe Biden is now a strong favourite in the betting markets to be the next president of the United States. So at about, as I said, about 65% likelihood compared to about 35% for Donald Trump. So, okay, so let's now turn back a little bit to the debates, which, had up until this morning enthralled the world's media, and which we had spent quite a lot of time preparing a podcast on. So in terms of doing that, I think we'll start off maybe, Richard, by setting the scene about talking about presidential debates generally, how they can or whether they can affect a presidential election campaign. So maybe we could start off by talking about what it is we know or what it is we think we know about this topic.
Well, I think you could make a case for they matter. You could make a similar case for they don't matter, Matt. I think in the they do matter column, we can go back and look at this from a historical perspective. If you go back to 1960, the Kennedy versus Nixon debates, the whole thing was tied very much into the appearance of these two men. And I think the appearances is pretty important for us now, because after all, we're talking about two 70-year-old plus men whose physical and mental fitness seems to be a bit of an ongoing theme. Even if you look back from a British point of view, when Parliament first started to be televised in 1989, Conservative MP Ian Gow gave the first televised speech, and he famously read out a letter he'd had from an image agency. And he said, the impression you make on television depends on your image, 55%, with your voice and body language accounting for 38% of your impact, and actually only 7% depends on what you're actually saying. And in 1960, 40% of Americans tuned in for the debate, and what they saw was not things actually being made up, but a story about makeup. Kennedy was bronzed, he was youthful, he was relaxed, weeks on the road in the sunshine in the campaign. Nixon had just come out of hospital. He was thin, he was gaunt, he had very fast-growing stubble, and he was advised to put on some makeup by his advisors. The makeup melted under the lights, it washed him out, he had a very ill-fitting grey suit on, and one commentator said, look, he didn't just die, he actually looked like he'd be embalmed as well. For many commentators, that was the clincher, and it swung over Kennedy's way after that. In the They Don't Make a Difference column, 2016, Hillary Clinton was ahead after all of those debates in every single meaningful scientific poll. But of course, she still lost. What we can say now, though, is Biden does actually have a bigger lead than Clinton had in 2016. 2016. And finally, with so few people apparently yet to make up their minds, US politics is becoming increasingly entrenched. So maybe nothing is liable to make a difference. A poll run by someone who used to be a pollster for 10 Downing Street actually suggests there are only 4 million floating voters. Mm-hmm. And out of those floating voters, 42% are saying it's a good chance they'll go for Biden. 34% are saying there's a good chance they'll go for Trump. Of course, we have to temper that with the idea that Trump will probably do better that in the polls, because apparently lots of people are ashamed to admit they'd actually vote for him. So whichever school of thought, they do matter or they don't matter, whichever one of those you ascribe to, the key thing is for even of those people who to this point have taken an ambivalent view are probably now unable to avoid this election. And so for that alone, you could say that these are really pivotal moments as we're getting closer to election day.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's funny because I often use the Nixon-Kennedy debate in my teaching, so I've watched it several times. And, you know, one of the details he didn't mention was Nixon's suit more or less exactly matches the background in the set. So it's just
he looked like a floating head.
Yeah, like a floating death skull, you know, didn't make a good impression on TV. And Kennedy looks like he's been, I don't know, cut out of a movie or something. You know, it's an amazing image, and anyone who's interested in this stuff, you can watch it on YouTube.
He comes across as the slightly worried, gaunt competitor against the kind of all-American boy, doesn't it?
Very much so. And kind of building on that idea, Elena, you know, Richard talks about how much image matters and sort of personality, how much that dominates the evaluations. I wonder, you know, could you talk a little bit about how that tends to play out?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we all know that, really speaking, policy should be central to any kind of political race. But as Richard mentioned earlier, these personal evaluations are just as, or if not more important, because this is a chance for the candidates to win the public over by attempting to be a presidential. So I think what's interesting with the debate that took place a few days ago is the different ways that both candidates interpret what it means to be presidential. So we've got Trump, who embodied this kind of alpha dog approach through his stature, the volume of his voice, these kind of bullying tactics that he used as a way of going after Biden. And I also think that Biden had quite a lot to prove during this debate. Despite his political record, there were lots of talk on conservative media from people like Rudy Giuliani, who were saying that Biden was ill, that he has dementia. But I think for the most part, he came across pretty well. He talked about policy. He smiled. His voice was much softer and comforting. He addressed the camera and kind of spoke directly to the public when talking about COVID. And he had a much, much more calmer demeanour. But there were moments, I think, where Trump really got to Biden and he did lash out. And I'll talk about that in a few moments. But I think what we also have to remember with the presidency is that it's not just about the leaders. It's also about their relationship with the First Lady too. And I think over the past 4 years, we've seen lots of kind of examples and memes around of Trump's relationship with Melania and that it's not a happy one. Lots of examples of cold body language and, you know, slapping his hand away.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, this was also on display at the end of the debate where there was this kind of weird arm rub exchange between the both of them. But what we saw with Biden, on the other hand, was this kind of image of domestic bliss where we had this kind of long embrace between him and his wife. So how this kind of translates then in terms of how people view who is more presidential is whether or not they go along with maybe Trump's alpha approach, or maybe Biden's kind of measured family man persona. That could be maybe a welcome relief to America's decisive political landscape right now.
The funny thing that's happened since then, of course, is people have been speculating all along that Trump marriage is not very happy and that his wife might be dumping him at any stage soon. Well, if the tax revelations are true, then things have very much changed for her, because instead of her taking half his fortune, it sounds like she might inherit a couple of £100 million in the hole, you know? So maybe that's made for some interesting tea time conversation in the White House.
Yeah, I can imagine. So I saw a campaign ad. I think it's because I'm researching this stuff and getting all these campaign ads. But this one was saying the Trump family was the first family in whatever, how many years that didn't have a dog in the White House, and was showing all the different dogs of the different presidents. And then it ends with Joe Biden hugging his dog, who I think is called Champ. So yeah, the American dream there. But like, what struck me about what you said, Elena, is, in a sense, depending on what spin you listen to after the debate, you'll get a very different picture of who was presidential. So like, I was watching Sean Hannity on Fox News.
Oh, same.
Yeah, and he was talking about how Trump had steamrollered Biden, how Trump was a warrior.
Yeah, gladiator
very much
warrior.
This alpha frame. And then if you watch any of the kind of left coverage internationally or in America, it's about how it's very Trump focused. It's about how unpresidential Trump was. And I think Biden even says that this is so unpresidential towards the end of the first segment. And I suppose that does connect to this point about how and when and why do debates matter. So there's quite a lot of political science research that says it's really a combination of people's initial feelings and then the frame that they get from the media, the spin room, thereafter. So like I mentioned earlier, 73 million people watched it, but most people were watching it on Fox News. I think close to 18 million people. It was the biggest single network that people were watching it on. And so what they'll have seen is so different, like even though they're watching the same thing, compared to somebody who's watching it on one of the more liberal networks. And then just connecting to what Richard was saying, certainly like betting markets are a lot newer than presidential debates. So we don't have any market data from Nixon, Kennedy, but like all the debates where there have been betting markets running have seen pretty significant shifts. I think people like to bet when there's a debate on. I think it's like it's sort of like a sport, right? Experience, like a football match or something. But like, again, connecting to what Richard said, it doesn't always show you what's going to happen at the end of the day. So, for example, I think the first Betfair have a blog about all these debates and how the market moved. And so John Kerry was seen to have done really well, in terms of the first debate with Bush. You guys might remember there was a story that Bush had an earpiece that was feeding him speaking points. Obama in 2008 moved significantly into a stronger favor position. And I think that was kind of to do with, McCain was a very experienced operator and Obama was still sort of seen as a rookie, but he came through it quite smoothly. It moved towards Romney in 2012. Most people reckon that Obama had an uncharacteristically poor performance. And following up on what Richard said, it moved pretty dramatically towards Hillary Clinton in 2016. And so to summarize, it moved every time, but 3 out of 4 times it moved towards the person who lost the election. So, I think you do have to take that with a little bit of a pinch of salt. And I think it is to do with, you have to think a little bit about the people who are betting. What's the framing that they've seen afterwards of the debate, and how is that swaying them? So let's talk about this debate. Like, it was mental, right?
Yeah.
I did stay up, and I was like, I saw people tweeting, "Oh, you shouldn't have stayed up. It was a lot of rubbish." I thought it was amazing. I thought it was epic. It was like, it was entertaining. I don't know, Elena, what do you think? What did you make of the events of the debate?
Well, I kind of watched this about 5 o'clock in the morning because I don't think I was brave enough to stay up that late, Matt. But we all know that it's conventionally it should be based around a certain amount of topics. So I think on this occasion, it was both candidates' records in office, stories around the Supreme Court, coronavirus, the economy, race and violence in the US, and then also the integrity of the election. So all kind of really important points that we've been looking at in the news over the last few weeks. And what was quite interesting is the New York Times actually introduced the story on this, it being a clash of style and ideas. But honestly, I think we all know it was anything but that. So I think what we essentially saw was Trump just trying to dominate the discussion by interrupting Biden at every opportunity. And I think it was marked at around 73 times. The reason why he did this, we all know, I think there were lots of stories out there at the time that Biden was going to be very prepared for this debate. And I think Trump had a very kind of different approach to it. So I think his tactic was to interrupt Biden, to rattle Biden, and to create confusion. And in most cases, I think Biden did keep his cool, but there were a number of occasions where he just completely played into Trump's hand by telling him to shut up, calling him a clown, also the worst president America has ever seen. And I don't mean that he did himself a real disservice there, I think, because it's not really in keeping with this, Biden's core message of restoring decency and leadership in the White House. But I don't know. I mean, I suppose how would any of us react to being constantly interrupted? So I think his game plan was really interesting there with Trump. I think they knew that Biden was fully prepared for the debate. And I think the interruptions were used as a way to disrupt Biden's rehearsed answers. And on a couple of occasions, it did actually work. I think Wallace had to remind, so Wallace was the moderator. So he had to remind Biden of the question at one point, and there was actually a couple of cases where Wallace had forgotten the question he asked as well, because I think he was constantly asking Trump to just be quiet, as in the nicest way possible. But Biden did manage to land some blows to Trump on his handling of coronavirus, but I think this debate will probably be remembered for all the wrong reasons. So infantile interruptions, these kind of vitriolic snipes, and most importantly, I think the big takeaway is Trump's failure to condemn white supremacist groups like the Proud Boys. So, and also I think the fact that Trump really doubled down on this undermining of trust within the election. So I think, how do we sum this up? I think we'll go with CNN Jack Tapper's analysis. So the debate was a hot mess, inside a dumpster fire, inside a train wreck. I think American democracy pretty much lost out here. And it's not surprising then, I think, that many people have questioned whether the next debate should take place at all, particularly when Trump refused to stick to the rules, tell the truth, or entertain civilized debate.
Yeah, I think, and I think we've seen from the organization that runs the debates, the Commission for Presidential Debates, that they're going to review the rules in the light of how badly conducted the debate was. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I mean, looking at the odds, I mean, it was a big night for Biden, and which wasn't what I thought when I was watching it. To be honest, I thought, Trump's interruption strategy, especially in the first half an hour, did discomfit Biden. And I read an article saying that Biden has suffered with stuttering earlier in his life, and that this was a sort of nearly a psychological ploy to cause him to fall over his own words. And I think you could see that he was getting knocked off his train of thought. But I think, so what's happened is really interesting in the markets, right? So when we last spoke, Biden was leading by about 6 or 7% in terms of probability of victory. Mm-hmm. That jumped kind of marginally in the immediate aftermath of the debate to around 10%. But then the next day, it doubled. It's undone all the work that Trump did in August to narrow the campaign. Mm. And when I look at it, I think this was a debate where Trump had to do something more than just be Trump, right? There had to be a decisive victory here. And I think a lot of the odds were factoring in that was quite likely to happen. And I think the way you characterized it, Elena, is Biden sort of just held his own.
Yeah.
But the expectation was that he would be dominated, and that didn't happen. It's so more than Biden really winning, even though the post-debate polls show him slightly ahead. I think it was Biden not losing. That was the kind of key thing here. And I think Biden, to be fair, like you said, he did lash out a couple of times, but overall, he managed not to answer really any substantive question. Yeah. Right. So he didn't answer the question about how they were going to obstruct, or whether they were going to obstruct the nomination of the new chief judge or the new justice. He managed to talk in very opaque terms about his economic plans and so on. So, there's a saying, they say that you should campaign in poetry and govern in prose, but actually Biden is campaigning in prose. Like, he is running one of the blandest campaigins I've ever seen. And
it's dull. It's dull with a capital D for Democrats, isn't it? I mean,
for me, that's all he needs to do.
Yeah.
And every day, I think now that goes past without some kind of shock, I think we're going to see Biden's odds shorten. I think it's starting to look like Trump needs something to happen. This was probably the biggest single chance for something to happen, and it didn't. So Richard, you've been kind of following this in the traditional media or the mainstream media. How have they processed this information?
Well, I've tried to filter out some of the noise, Matt, that's been sort of going on around it, but I think we can draw a few conclusions, and we can say that there were a number of things that most people agreed on. I think the first one was that it started bad and got worse. I think the other thing is that we've reached the next layer of antipathy between these two candidates, and I was minded of that old joke actually about the lifelong Republican supporter who was on his deathbed and announced that he was going to switch to becoming a Democrat. And his best friend, who was with him to nurse him in his last moments, said, look, for all of your life, you've been a staunch Republican. Why on earth would you want to become a Democrat right now? To which the reply was, I think I'd sooner it be one of them dying than one of us. And it sort of sums up the way that these people were going at each other. And I think you mentioned it being a sport. I mean, the sport that I was playing was I was looking at the Twitter discussions that were going on alongside the debate. And I think it's one of those times that you could honestly say that the discussion on social media was actually more cerebral than the event itself, you know? I think one tweeter summed it up really well and said, it's a time like this, it's great to be a Canadian. and I think we have at least one colleague who'd agree with that, I'm sure. Some other comments. Lewis Goodall, policy editor of BBC Newsnight, said, it's the most scrappy and terrible debate I've ever seen. Genuinely hard to say who won. In different ways, they both lost. Jay Rosen, high-profile journalism professor, said it's a national embarrassment. I think there was also a lot of agreement with what you've just said, actually, that Biden neither went forward nor went backwards, but maybe Trump actually did some damage to himself. And I think if you want a more nuanced conclusion, is that there were no winners, just a succession of losers. Trump, for infantilizing the platform, as Elena said, CBS News counted 73 interruptions. Biden lost for not managing to maximize that advantage he had over an opponent that was very much on the back foot after the tax revelations during the week. Moderator Fox News Chris Wallace has taken a lot of stick for not keeping better order.
I mean, what's the guy meant to do? Does he have to go like physically manhandle the candidates? I mean, I thought he did his best.
It's a tricky one. I mean, the other loser, apparently, you know, many people are saying, the democratic process within the US. Citizens have been expressing that they feel so let down, given that there are so many key issues that need to be discussed. And what they got was playground bickering. Yeah. And of course, you know, if you want to look even wider than that, you could say this whole notion of public debate, you know, really took a blow there, didn't it? It really suffered when we cannot get the most powerful nation on the face of the planet to actually engage with each other on any kind of sensible level. So in some ways, the consensus was it was a very depressing night across the board.
Yeah, and it's a funny one because I was thinking, you know, is this just Trump being Trump, right? So I went back and watched the Hillary Clinton, the first debate with Trump and Clinton, and I counted it was 12 minutes into the debate when he first interrupted. And I think by 12 minutes in this debate, they must have both interrupted dozens of times already. So there's definitely an escalation. It's not just Trump being Trump. It's beyond that. I think it's more serious. It was a shambles really to watch. If you're trying to learn anything about what they thought, if you want to watch, as I say, a gladiatorial contest, it was popcorn time for Matt Wall.
To continue a theme from last week, Matt, where I proclaimed great surprise that you were Irish. In some ways, it reminded me of the way that the Irish rugby team is sometimes said to play, is that their job there is to disrupt the other team. And you could argue that maybe Trump was following that Irish rugby plan, which was, you know, to make sure that the other team weren't allowed to play. And I think there was, you know, that was essentially what happened, wasn't it?
Yeah, but I do think he needed to do more. I think it was and there's a lot of debate in Irish rugby about that as well. But like you need to do more than just wreck the game and hope for the best. When you're, especially when you're a few points behind, as he was. Anyway, Elena, I was just going to ask if this has been, I mean, this seemed to me like a kind of a meme generator type debate. Has this been picked up in satire?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the TV satire, I mean, I've seen a few memes out there, particularly that, that image of the woman with the cat and, Trump being this kind of crazy woman, just spewing all this bile, and like Biden being the cat, just sat there all nonchalant. But in terms of the TV satire stuff, it's quite interesting, really. I mean, I've studied satire for quite some time, and I think the overall definition of what satire is it's a form of critical humour that emerges in the face of social ills. So we're kind of right in the middle of that. But sitting down to watch Trevor Noah, Seth Meyers, and Stephen Colbert this morning, what was interesting was just their genuine shock and just looking appalled and absolutely stunned by what had happened. I mean, I think I've wrote about this before, is this idea of, we're beyond satire at the moment. So it's really, really difficult for satirists to actually offer something meaningful and something that kind of encourages laughter, because there was nothing really to laugh about in terms of their analysis of the debate. So I think what I found, rather than there being this kind of these digs at Trump, there were a few, mocking his voice and mocking some of the things that he said. But most of the conversation within those three programs was about the damage that the debate had done to American democracy. So again, they focused on these kind of two key parts, this, frightening call from Trump to asking his supporters to watch the polls, which in theory means intimidating people at the polls, and also his failure to condemn white supremacy. So, but I think what's interesting is there's a slightly different approach that a lot of these satirists are taking now. Rather than maybe just showing at how awful everything is, they're trying to kind of flip that, and they're moving much more into those kind of fields of advocacy journalism. So offering solutions, albeit voting, but they're really encouraging their viewers to get out to help salvage American democracy. And I think Stephen Colbert in particular actually produced specific videos for each of the individual swing states.
That's a little bit like what Richard said. You kind of, now you're watching the politics for entertainment and going to the satirist for analysis. That's where, I suppose that's where we are. I think we're going to kind of draw it to a close there. So just to say, I think next week it might be interesting, and it's a point I think Richard was pushing at, to look at this uncertainty about the validity of the polls, the reasons why somebody can be so far back in the polls but still be considered by many people to be in with a really good chance of winning. So I think that's be something we'll look at next week, and I'm sure Donald and Joe will provide us with plenty of incidents along the way. So that's all for now, and I'd just like to close by saying thank you to our funder, who are the Cherish Digital Economy Centre at Swansea University, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Okay, thank you.